All right, continuing on here with our Judaism unit. One more discussion sheet here before we move on to the Christianity unit, and this is on the Ten Commandments. So this is Judaism discussion sheet 2. First of all, some historical circumstances of the Ten Commandments. We talked a lot about the meaning in Judaism as its essential contribution in the last video lecture, and that's of course key. And this being a philosophy course, that's what we're focusing on, is the values and the teachings in religions. But with the genesis of the Ten Commandments, it would be absurd to overlook the history completely. We have to touch on that as well, just as we touched on the history of Muhammad and the Quran and the beginnings of Islam. So, a real quick crash course here. You don't need any of this down. I mean, I'll start putting things on the board in a moment that you'll want down. But Judaism traces its origins, well, all the way back to Adam, of course. But there's not a huge amount said about Adam and the pre-lapsarian days. Sorry, the antediluvian, the pre-flood days. But Jewish thought would generally hold that there was a couple thousand years of human history before the flood, from Adam to the flood, which we know relatively little about. And then there are another 2,000 years from the flood to 0 AD or 0 BC, whichever way you want to look at it. And those 2,000 years have a lot happening. Relatively early on in those 2,000 years, we have Abraham, the one with whom the covenant was made. Abraham was asked to sacrifice his son, Isaac, and he passed the test. He did not actually sacrifice Isaac, but he passed the test of not withholding from God even his only son. Because of Abraham's sacrifice, willed but not executed, God made a covenant with Abraham. And this covenant was the beginning of Judaism, you could say, strictly speaking. And this covenant continued on down the generations, and we have Abraham, Isaac, and then Jacob. Abraham being the father of Isaac, Isaac being the father of Jacob, and then Jacob had 12 sons, and from these 12 sons proceed the famous 12 tribes of Israel. Now, not long after Jacob, in fact, even during Jacob's life, he and his family went into Egypt because there was a famine. Long story about Joseph being sold into slavery in Egypt, Joseph being one of Jacob's sons, and rising up to a high position, and such a high position in Egypt, in fact, that he was basically ruling Egypt just under the Pharaoh, helping Egypt to survive this horrible famine. During this famine, Jacob and the rest of the family comes into Egypt, and they thrive there, but eventually they're enslaved after the time of Joseph, when less noble Pharaoh came in later on. And then the Jews, although multiplying in Egypt, spent hundreds of years in horrid slavery in Egypt, always, however, remembering the covenant and the promises that God made much earlier with Abraham. So they're always praying for a deliverer. They're praying for deliverance after the century after century of this miserable slavery in Egypt. And we're somewhere around the 1000 BC. I'm not going to get specific with the dates. Somewhere around the 1000 BC mark, a little earlier than that. And eventually we have Moses. Moses coming about at a time when there was a slaughter of the male children because the Pharaoh did not want his reign to be usurped. But Moses escaped that. You've probably heard the story before of him being placed in a basket in the river and being picked up by none other than Egyptian royalty. So he was raised as Egyptian royalty, them not knowing that he was actually a Hebrew. And then it was Moses whom God called to deliver Israel from slavery in Egypt. And then the plagues, the phenomena, the miracles, the incredible stories written of in the book of Exodus. That's when those things occurred. And then Israel, by the hundreds and hundreds of thousands, is led out of Egypt by Moses, through the Red Sea, the parting of the sea, that miracle. But they wandered throughout the desert before reaching the promised land. That generation didn't reach the promised land. They had to, because they weren't particularly faithful to what God asked of them. So they're wandering through the desert all these years. In the midst of this wandering, they come to Mount Sinai. Moses, in prayer and fasting, goes up Mount Sinai, and he receives the Ten Commandments from God. And that brings us to our discussion sheet here. And these revelations in Judaism find their moral pinnacle in the Ten Commandments, and these remain the key moral contribution of Judaism. So let me just give you a couple of things for your notes for the circumstances of the origin of the Ten Commandments. We can have down there given to Moses at Mount Sinai / Horeb. That they were, quote, written with the finger of God. That's a quote from Exodus 31:18. And that's very important, especially for a Christian, because this distinguishes the Jewish moral law from the ceremonial and the Juridical precepts, which Christians believe they are dispensed from, which Jesus did specifically dispense Christians from. But the moral law is not dispensed from. The Jewish moral law, meaning the Ten Commandments and everything that goes along directly with them, is forever. That's written by the finger of God. The whole Mosaic law, yes, Moses wrote it, but this Moses received directly from the finger of God, the Ten Commandments. So everything that goes along, all the teachings that necessarily go along with any of the Ten Commandments, those are never abrogated. Jesus didn't do away with any of those. Those don't go away like the shellfish and the eating pork prohibitions go away with Christianity. Anyway, that's for the Christianity unit. Just a brief note on that for now. Okay, so written with the finger of God. There we have given during the Exodus, during Israel's time wandering the desert after being delivered from Egypt. And we should also know that they're placed in the Ark of the Covenant. Where exactly they are to this day, that's a mystery. I believe there's an Indiana Jones movie about that. Okay. So there's different ways. So we all know the Ten Commandments. I'm not saying you all have them memorized, but you've all heard of them. You know the gist of them. But you might not realize there's a couple different ways of putting them. If you open up the Torah and you actually read Exodus, where Moses is up there receiving them, it's not a nice, neat list of 10 points. It's paragraphs of stuff. And to make them easier to remember and to consolidate their main teachings, we have the tradition of the Ten Commandments from them. Because it's not just a direct quote from Exodus, there's different ways of consolidating the teachings, or it's not changing them, it's just, making them easier to remember. There's different ways of doing that, a couple different primary ways. There's more than two ways, but I'll just talk about two for now. We have and this will be the next question down. What is the origin of the two primary ways of delineating the Ten Commandments? Well, we've got Lutherans and Catholics. These are just different traditions to this day of delineating them. And of course, I know we're in the Judaism unit here, but of course we know that the majority, the vast, 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 vast majority of people in the world who regard the Ten Commandments as divine revelation are Christians. Jews do as well, of course, but they're a much smaller number to this day. Lutherans and Catholics follow Augustine's delineation. And later Protestants follow Origen. Origen and Augustine are two different church fathers. Okay. And I'm going to run through Augustine's delineation here. So, but just know that they're not very different. It's just, off the top of my head, not sure if I get. I think the origins delineation. I think it's got the don't have any graven images as its own, and then it combines what Catholics and Lutherans regard as the 9th and the 10th into one. So it's still 10, but one of them has its own commandment, and 2 of the other ones are put into one. So it still adds up to 10. All right, I'm going to erase this. So just go ahead and pause the video if you still need to jot this down for the first 2 questions there. And here we go, the 10 Commandments. I'm going to paraphrase these for the sake of time here and space to fit them into your notes well. First commandment. Have no strange gods before me. I am very heavily paraphrasing here for the sake of space. No false idols. There is absolutely one God, and to regard anything else as a god, in thought, word, or deed, implicitly or explicitly, is idolatry, is blasphemy. That would be the first and the greatest commandment. This would be not only an exhortation against worshiping anything but God, but even treating anything as if it were the meaning and origin and end of your life. You can fall into this breaking of the first commandment with other subtler methods, with other subtler problems. You can start living life in a way that is completely revolving around your career or your friends or your goals or things like that. And that's kind of a subtle violation of the first commandment here. Second commandment: do not take the name of the Lord in vain. Not take the name of the Lord in vain. My goodness, Christians do not do a good job of obeying this one today. The name of God, Lord. Christians, of course, believe Jesus is God, so Jesus, Christ, those words can never be used as an exclamation or as a curse. That is blasphemy, according to the 10 Commandments. It's a violation of the second commandment. The violation of any commandment, any one of the 10 Commandments, is really bad, but when you're talking about the second, it's particularly bad. You can say, ancient Jews were so serious about this that the best name for God for them, Yahweh, I am, only the high priest was even allowed to say that, and only once a year, and only in the Holy of Holies. Like, they were so you could be put to death just for saying that word when you're not allowed to. Today, Christians just flippantly take the name of the Lord in vain all the time. So that's a serious thing that Christians need to reconsider if they want to bother calling themselves Christians. Christians regard the 10 Commandments as still binding. And this is the second commandment. Don't take the name of the Lord in vain. Not only don't use it as a curse, but don't just use it as a random exclamation. You can use it as a prayerful exclamation, of course. You can talk about God all you want, bring up his name all you want, but it can't be flippant, it can't be in vain. It can't be an mere exclamation when you stub your toe. It can't be a curse for sure. It can't be used as a swear word. Okay. Keep holy the Lord's Day, third commandment. For Christians, that's Sunday. For Jews, that's Saturday. Ancient Jews and Orthodox Jews to this day very famously hold this incredibly strictly. Jesus came and he said, look, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So he's reminding people this should not work against its purpose, which is the human flourishing. But it's still very important. We need that day of rest. We need that holy day once a week. We can't work 24/7. We'll destroy ourselves, our families, and our spiritual lives if we do so. Keep holy the Lord's Day. 4. Honor thy father and mother. For children, those under the age of 18, this means obedience. A child has to, in obeying the 10 Commandments, a child has to obey his father and mother in all things but sin. And this the fourth commandment does not have an expiration date. You have to keep honoring your father and mother even when you're an adult, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you are required to obey them once you're an adult. You have to sometimes make your own decisions at that point. 5, you shall not kill. Pretty straightforward, right? Don't do it. Now, I'm giving you the most commonly quoted translation here, but actually a better translation is "you shall not murder." Killing has never been condemned as intrinsically evil in the Jewish or the Christian tradition. In other words, you can legitimately kill in self-defense if it's in very specific circumstances, in a just war also. But you shall not murder is an absolute prohibition. There is absolutely no situation where you are permitted by the Ten Commandments to directly and intentionally kill an innocent human being. Not even to save your own life, no matter what. You can never do it. It's contravening a commandment. 6, you shall not commit adultery. No cheating on your spouse, no matter what. This also condemns all associated forms of impurity. Any and all sexual acts are reserved for marriage alone. The modern world really doesn't like hearing that, but that is a commandment. This includes the 6th commandment condemns all uses of the sexual faculty outside of marriage. This happens to be the most grave contravention of that, to actually cheat on a spouse. But that's just, that's still an umbrella commandment that condemns all those various contraventions thereof. 7, you shall not steal. 8, I don't think "you shall not steal" requires too much explanation. Can't do that either. You shall not bear false witness. Don't lie. Do not say that something is other than it is. That is evil to do so. 9, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife. This outlaws all lust. So the 6th commandment outlaws all actual sexual acts that are outside of marriage. The 9th commandment goes even further. You can't even lust. You can't even have these impure thoughts. 10, you shall not covet your neighbor's goods. You cannot be greedy and envious, in other words. So the 9th and the 10th commandments here, these are very significant because these remind us that it's not good enough to just externally avoid a few things. You can't just, you can't just not steal. You have to also not covet other people's goods. You can't live a greedy, materialistic life where you're always wanting these things that you don't have. Even if you're not stealing them, just not stealing them isn't enough. You also can't covet them. You can't just not cheat on your spouse. You need to also not lust. So this is an intense moral regimen, but it's not optional. And it never passes away. This is forever. No Christian is exempted from this. No Jew is exempted from this. No matter how much you hear otherwise. This cannot change. So there we have it, the 10 Commandments. Judaism's most famous contribution. And the world would be doing a lot better today if we respected these a little more. So don't forget these, have them down in your notes, and you'll be all set for this discussion sheet. And I'm going to end our recording now to keep this video on the short side.